This is the first of a series of presentations on defending Australia. This first presentation is about understanding the scale of the problem. It is also about Australia's strategy and defence forces at the beginning of 2023. I've selected 2023 because that is the year the Defence Strategic Review came out and things changed. This presentation will start with explaining the tyranny of distance and its impact on strategic policy. It will compare the geographic scale of World War II in Europe with that of continental Australia. This comparison will actually surprise many of you. This is a map of Australia without any real reference. Without this reference, it is impossible to properly understand scale. Scale is something that most people, including Australians, have a great deal of difficulty understanding. This also applies to the defence of Australia. We all know that the country called Australia occupies an entire continent, also called Australia. It is unique in the world, but when you call up a map of Australia, lacking any other reference, it doesn't look that big. Yet, one of the most important points to remember when discussing its defence is the impact of that scale on the strategy, tactics, and the weapons platforms and systems that are used by Australia and the United States. In Australian strategic policy, understanding scale is literally everything. Let's start off by comparing Australia to contemporary Europe facing the threat of Putin's totalitarian Russia. The distance from Moscow to Berlin in a direct line is about 1,600 kilometres. In between, there are several major and minor cities. These cities are connected by multiple rail and road networks, and all are serviced by several large airfields, both military and civilian. This infrastructure is incredibly important for the movement of military formations and their supplies. Compare this to Australia. This same distance will get you directly from Sydney to about halfway across the continent, seemingly just past Adelaide. Yet in Australian slang, you are in the outback, beyond the black stump, or even just whoop whoop. At this point, you are hundreds of kilometres away from any major infrastructure, including access to any significant fuel supply. In fact, in order to reach Perth, you need to double the distance from Berlin to Moscow. Perth, of course, is the only major city on Australia's west coast. In comparison to the highly urbanised regions of Central Europe, the only city of any size between Sydney and Perth is Adelaide. Logistically, all cross-continental movement is restricted to the one major highway and the one railway line that passes through Adelaide. Even worse, most of that railway line is single track. Another comparison is to draw a line connecting the major east coast cities of Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney and Brisbane. It is slightly shorter than the distance from Moscow to Berlin. This area is extremely important as it contains the bulk of Australia's population. Approximately 20 million Australians live in these coastal regions on the east coast. There are only around 6 million people in the rest of Australia, and this remaining area is about 3/4 the size of the contiguous United States. Another way to compare Australia with the United States is by population density. It is around 44 persons per square kilometre in the contiguous United States, whereas it is only about 3 persons per square kilometre in all of Australia. A better comparison for the bulk of Australia is the sparsely populated US state of Alaska. Take out the southeast population centre, plus the two state capitals of Perth and Adelaide, and the population density becomes 1 person for every 2 square kilometres, the same as Alaska, but in an area 3 times larger. That gives you some idea of the scale, but let's look at what that means militarily using some historical examples. This box shows the Second World War that was fought on the mainland of Europe, from the Normandy battlefields in the west to Stalingrad in the east, Leningrad in the north, and Salerno in the south. That entire theatre of war in Europe fits almost perfectly within continental Australia. Another comparison is this map of the tremendous war of manoeuvre known as the Eastern Front during the Second World War, from the first battle at the fortress city of Brest to Leningrad in the north, past the gates of Moscow down to Stalingrad, and back again. Millions of men fought on both sides during this campaign. That battlefield would fit into the state of Western Australia. This is that same triangle from Brest to Leningrad to Stalingrad, and from Stalingrad back to Brest. In this area there are no major roads, airports, and only one port. In fact, there is so much of Western Australia left that you could also easily include the entire 1943 and 1944 southern campaigns in the Ukraine. We also need to understand the issue of scale when talking about the seas and oceans surrounding Australia. The distance from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane is 7,600 kilometres, which is almost exactly the same distance from Pearl Harbor to Washington. The distance from the US naval base of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean to Perth is well over 5,000 kilometres. However, like Pearl Harbor, it is also about 8,000 kilometres by sea to the major population centres on Australia's east coast. These examples of scale will, hopefully, give you an idea of some of the problems faced in developing any strategy for defending Australia. So let's get down to specifics. After the Second World War, and in response to communist expansion, Australia developed a strategic policy known as forward defence. It had seen a largely conscript Australian army deployed to Vietnam, Borneo, and Malaysia to fight communist expansion. In the decade after the end of the Vietnam War and our defeat, the policy of forward defence was in tatters, and Australian strategic policy drifted along in a type of intellectual malaise. Then, in 1986, one of the great Australian strategic analysts, Paul Dibb, released his report. It was to become the bedrock of Australian defence planning for nearly 4 decades. His report developed what became known as the 3 pillars, which still form the heart of the Defence Strategic Review nearly 4 decades later. The first and second pillar reflected the impact of geography upon Australian defence. The first pillar was controlling the sea and air approaches to Australia. Again, this map doesn't show scale. With the exception of the F-111s, now long gone, in nearly 50 years there was not an Australian combat aircraft with enough range to get anywhere near these points on their own. In the event of conflict, Australia's 6 submarines had to patrol a line equal to that from the major US base of Norfolk to the major UK naval base of Portsmouth right across the Atlantic Ocean. In comparison, the US Navy and Royal Navy have around 30 nuclear attack submarines to patrol the same area, plus submarines from France, Norway and Canada. Australia has New Zealand, whose Navy has a combat strength comparable to the state of Tasmania. Controlling these approaches inevitably created the second pillar, which was to keep states to our north and northeast free of any hostile power. How this pillar applies to Indonesia is left unsaid in the Dibb report. The third pillar reflected Australia's need to maintain a technological edge on any potential opponent so that the ADF is not put at a disadvantage fighting a more numerous foe. The heart of this third pillar was based around the ANZUS Treaty, especially our relationship with the United States of America. It is important to note that, despite popular misconceptions, it is not an alliance, and I'll talk about that in later presentations. Regardless, the close relationship with the US provides Australia with access to advanced weaponries such as the LUSV, shown here. At the beginning of 2023, Australia was left with a heritage of this strategic policy. It required what was called a balanced defence force, with neither the Army, Navy, nor Air Force taking precedence. The Army structure ensured it could always deploy at least one combat brigade. The balanced force concept provided Australia with the capabilities to send us peacekeepers or peacemakers all around the world to places such as Rwanda, Cambodia, the decade-long campaign to restore the failed state of the Solomon Islands, and the big one, Timor. It also operated with the US-led coalitions in the liberation of Kuwait and in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was the Australian Army who did all the heavy lifting in these conflicts, although Royal Australian Navy ships also operated in the Persian Gulf. Of all these deployments, only Timor and the Solomon Islands were directly related to Australia's strategic policy. The Middle Eastern deployments, sometimes called wars of choice, were primarily about ANZUS, though it was actually a little bit more nuanced than that summary. Now that's the history. Let's examine what the Australian Defence Force really looked like at the beginning of 2023. Before I do, let's go back to scale. In numbers, under the balanced force concept, the entire deployable strength of the Australian Defence Force, that is Army, Air and Sea, was roughly equivalent to a single US Marine Expeditionary Brigade and its supporting ships. The Army consisted of 3 combat brigades, all with an identical structure. One was based in Brisbane, one in Townsville, the last in Darwin. However, the brigades rotated yearly between 3 levels of readiness, with one full strength and deployable, another preparing for deployment, and the third rebuilding. It also has a special forces in both Western Australia and Sydney. The Royal Australian Navy's deployment currently remains unchanged. It is split between Sydney and Perth. In general, the larger ships such as Australia's amphibious ships and air warfare destroyers are based in Sydney. The Anzac frigates and Collins-class submarines based in Perth. It is over 4,000 kilometres to sail from one base to the other, and that would take a better part of a week. Without significant redeployment, it is not a combined force under its peacetime structure. The Royal Australian Air Force's fighter aircraft are split between 3 airfields: Williamtown to the north of Sydney, Amberley near Brisbane, and one F-35 squadron is based at RAAF Tyndall in Northern Australia. Its Poseidons and Wedgetails are largely based in Adelaide, though they do redeploy as required. The RAAF also maintains what are known as bare bases across Northern Australia. These bare bases have no planes, stores, personnel, or defences of any type. Due to the comparatively small range of its fighter bombers, the strategy is to deploy the RAAF squadrons to these forward airfields as needed. Now, once again, back to scale. This is clearly not a large force when trying to defend a continent. In order to counter the impact of geography, Australia has developed 3 very impressive capabilities given the size of its armed forces. The first is surveillance. Following his 1986 report, Paul Dibb championed one of the most important assets Australia has in monitoring activity on the approaches to Australia, obviously one of his pillars. It is the Jindalee Operational Radar Network. It consists of 3 stations using Doppler radar. Its powerful emitters bounce a signal off the ionosphere that allows an extraordinary degree of accuracy and detail that covers an extended area. However, due to its reliance on the ionosphere to provide its range, dawn, dusk and severe weather can severely reduce its capabilities. The RAAF also provides surveillance using its Wedgetail aircraft, as well as using its Poseidon anti-submarine planes in a reconnaissance role. The second important capability is in-flight refuelling. The RAAF fighters are designed for European distances, not Australian. The RAAF uses tankers for in-flight refuelling, plus basing at forward airfields to extend their fighters' area of operations, as well as of its other aircraft. The third is transport. The RAAF provides a range of transport aircraft, with its powerful Globemasters able to transport the Army's tanks. They are, however, very vulnerable, both in the air and when landing to deliver their cargo. In general, the Australian Defence Force has modern and technologically advanced equipment. The heart and soul of the RAAF is its 72 F-35 fifth-generation fighters. The Royal Australian Navy has powerful ships such as its 3 air warfare destroyers and its 6 Collins-class submarines. However, the submarines and also its fleet of 8 Anzac frigates are based on designs nearly half a century old, and they are in urgent need of updating. Despite this drawback, Australia's relationship with the United States provides these ships and planes with the latest in technology and weapons. The weaponry of the 3 combat brigades of the Australian Army, in comparison, is a mixed bag. Communication and personal weapons are state-of-the-art, and its Abrams tanks is one of the most powerful tanks in the world, but it is also designed to fight in Europe. Unfortunately, its M113s are based on designs that predate the Vietnam War and were due for upgrades decades ago. Its ASLAVs are also being replaced, but in far smaller numbers. In general, the Army in 2023 had little or no modern equipment, such as modern infantry fighting vehicles, mobile artillery, or any medium to long-range air defence. This was the Australian Defence Force, its underlying strategy, structure and capabilities that carried it through the peacekeeping or peacemaking operations around the world. The professionalism of its men and women has repeatedly shown them to be amongst the best. Then, in April 2023, the government presented the Defence Strategic Review and everything changed. This review is the subject of the third video, while structural weaknesses within defence are covered in the following video. Here are a few books and websites that people interested in Australia's defence may find useful. The first is, naturally, my book. It looks at issues such as strategic cultures, the excessive cost of Australia's defence, and the failure of debate over Australia's strategic policy. Hugh White's book, How to Defend Australia, was written in 2019. Quite simply, it is a must-read. It explains the Defence Strategic Review better than the report explains itself. In my opinion, our Defence Department should not have spent millions of dollars rewriting his book. They should have just let him earn the royalties. General Molan's book, Danger on Our Doorstep, is an interesting description of Australia within a greater Pacific War from a retired and respected Major General. His death was a tragedy for any non-conformist analysis of Australian defence policy. Finally, there is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It publishes consistently strong analysis on defence issues facing Australia. Anybody interested in Australian defence policy should register for their free newsletter, podcasts, and online presentations. Hopefully, this has interested you enough to have a look at the second presentation, which is on structural weaknesses in Australian defence.